I think the art community in general does a pretty good job actually talking about how important it is to use reference. But most of the time, that discussion is centered around drawing real life things that you can find, on planet Earth. Um, like if you're setting out to sketch, a tree, for example, you probably should look at an actual tree, really study it, think about it, then start sketching it, rather than just coming up with something off the top of your head. But I think it's a little bit less talked about how important it is to use real world reference when designing fantasy that no one has ever seen before. Something that's, quote unquote, completely original. I think it's actually even more important to really base that in real world reference and, it'll always have a stronger design, a bigger connection with the audience, and then it'll just be a less painful process, I think, than trying to come up with something completely fresh, and, quote unquote, completely original. So just to back up that concept for myself a little bit, um, I think I forget where I heard this first, but there's a concept out there that originality always comes from mixing two things. So you've probably heard the phrase that there's nothing original anymore. I don't know if that's true. There probably are geniuses out there who can, come up with something that's completely new off the top of their head. But I think a lot of really famous, stories and even music groups and artists, you could probably think about what it is that makes them original, and maybe what two things that they mixed to get that. So I don't know, in Lord of the Rings, I guess there's like two aspects of it. There's the story, and then there's like the visual aesthetics of the movies. I mean, like the story could be maybe it's mixing like an ancient, I think it was Norse mythology that it was based on with some more modern themes. I know those don't necessarily go together, but when Tolkien sat down to write story, I think he like drew from his World War II experiences, and I think that influenced the storyline. I think in Harry Potter, even like it maybe the concept of like a wizard school wasn't completely, like, no one had ever done that before, but I think the way in which she mixed that wizard, like young wizard school storyline with some like much darker, like overall themes of prophecies and fate that hadn't quite been done before, that's what made it original and really stuck out to people. I mean, I could go down this list and I'm sure we could all think of things. I've heard like the band Queen mixed, rock and opera music to become original. The Beatles, maybe like John Lennon and Paul McCartney. I'm the same with the, all the your favorite visual artists. I think what makes them feel completely fresh and new, it might actually have been from something older that they mixed with a new concept. So keeping that in mind, if I'm going to start a fantasy design of any type, we're going to try and visually distill two things that we're going to mix together that no one has ever mixed before, and that will give us our fresh idea, even though those individual things aren't completely original. So before we get started, I've actually wrote down some keywords just to have a concept of what I want to do with this piece. I don't actually do this every single time I start a personal piece. I'm way too lazy for that. But I think I do always have something like this in the back of my mind when I start a piece. And then, of course, if you're doing professional work, there's a brief that usually gives you some parameters to work with. And I think that's actually sort of underrated with personal work when people start a big project, because I think there's a tendency for people to, and myself included, to like want to be able to do anything with a creative project, but actually setting some parameters really forces you to start. Well, it forces you to start designing within those parameters. So it actually helps your design process, even just to write down some things that it has to work with it. So for example, I think in the back of my mind, I kind of want to do some high fantasy architecture. By high fantasy, I just mean something that's a little bit more pushed, a little bit less like classic and like seen before. So something that's, just more original, hopefully. I was thinking maybe the architecture could be elvish or maybe some other creature. I'm not totally sure yet. I definitely know I want it to be ornate and beautiful and not so much like a fortress, even though I am going to have some castle reference, but we'll talk about that in a second. And then I might introduce some sort of sci-fi element. It doesn't have to be pure fantasy. I mean, those two kind of go together a lot, but I think just I really like sometimes when you're looking at an image, you can't exactly pick a genre that it would fit into. I think that sometimes helps the design. Okay, so let's talk about actual reference. So I've brought some pictures that actually, let's start with the macro. So these are some photos of travels of mine. These are actually photos that I took that I'm going to get started as my macro concepts to help me start this process. So just real quick, so macro and micro, macro meaning like the big picture, micro meaning kind of the smaller details in the small picture. I kind of got that phrase actually from my friend Sathish Kumar. I actually don't know how to pronounce his name, but he's a really great designer. You should definitely check him out. I'll add a link to his work somewhere. But I think I was doing this kind of thing before for my personal work, but when he mentioned that he organizes it into macro and micro, it really stood out to me as a good way to do it. So for example, in my macro, I have the big picture of reference that I'm going to use for my design. So in this case, it's some Italian and Spanish architecture, very classical feeling, some wider shots of the buildings, some like overall kind of landscapes that I think would, be a good influence to me. And then I also have some castles and architecture from France that I took when I was traveling there a few years ago. And even though these are, they're similar in terms that they're both like stone structures, and they both have like a medieval era kind of feel. I think the specifics of what appeals to me about this page versus this page, they are slightly different. So I'm gonna have to kind of choose which one I'm gonna pull from. But I just put them all in here to give myself options, basically. And then over here in micro, these are some photos that I've taken just basically just walking around. I mean, this was like on a hike somewhere, I think in Yosemite, but these are just like walking around the neighborhood. And I think it really helps to kind of always have that part of your design brain turned on. So if you see something really cool, just go ahead, take a picture of it. I mean, you'll look stupid to the people around you, but you never know. It might, spark an idea of some kind for a future design. So, in this case, it's like the specific thing about it on a smaller scale that appealed to me, I think, is the color palette, where it's this like nice mossy green and then this really desaturated bark. I mean, here, I guess it was kind of like the texture of these like circular leaves and then these like long shapes. I mean, it's a bit esoteric, to be honest, about what it is that appeals to me. Here, I think it's like this really long shape and then these very small squiggly shapes. But I think that's where the artistry comes in. Like everyone's going to look at this and see something totally different that appeals to them and that they would want to use for their design. So I'll just give you some more examples here. There's some really cool aspects to this, I think, just like in the grouping of these flowers. The coloring I kind of think is interesting. This, like, again, this might seem super basic, like it's just leaves, but I think in the back of my mind, something about like the shininess here kind of appealed to me. I thought was kind of cool. This is just a bark of a tree that I thought looked like an eye, but then like the texture itself is actually kind of cool, especially if you zoom in. So I think there's parts of that we could just straight, pull from. and then break it down and apply it to our final design. And then the last example here, it doesn't have to be, you know, like organic plants and stuff. Like, I don't even remember where I took this photo. I just found it in my phone. But this is kind of a cool pattern. Maybe it could be influenced by, and then, you know, like the trimming. I just like how this looks. So I have to break it down later. I'm not even sure what it is about it that appeals to me right now. But there's something there that I think I could use. And then even just like the value breakup of this, where it's like these really darks and then these light lines. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, we're going to have to do a phase where we actually start sketching and really thinking about what it is that's cool about these. But for now, I just know that these are cool pictures, I think, that it took, and we're going to try and use them in some way. And then lastly, before we even get started, I have this mood folder here. These are also photos I took just, you know, on various adventures. But rather than the design aspects of them, I think it's more just the mood that appeals to me here that I might try and take. So by mood, I mean the lighting, the color palette, and just the feel, basically. So I could imagine, you know, if I design a fantasy, you know, elvish castle, it might be in a setting similar to one of these, even if the designs don't look anything like this at the end, which is totally fine. I just think there's something cool about this really red sun, this particular lighting setup, this particular, you know, sunset backlit thing, and then just kind of like the empty feel of this garden. And another example of the mood. This again is just walking around a neighborhood, but I guess it's mostly the lighting here. But again, it's just sort of the setting, the mood that I think I'll try and use here. And it's important to split this up. Like, you know, not all of these photos would work for macro, micro, and mood. I think just this process of organizing it into folders actually helped me a lot, you know, push forward with what my design should be. Right, because I could have used like this texture here as a micro, and tried and, you know, use that texture on one of my castles, but I don't think it's actually that appeals to me. It's more the design of this architecture. All right, let's get started with the next section, which is really breaking down some of this reference and actually starting to do a little bit of sketching and figure out how to actually mix our two ideas. So real quick before we do that, there's a tiny bit more groundwork we have to do, and talk about breaking down some actual reference. So the big concept I want to get across is that of shapes. And the main idea that I want to make sure we talk about is that everything in your reference can be broken down into big, medium, and small shapes. And that is talked about, I think, a lot in concept art in terms of like composition, especially in character design and environment design. But when you're actually designing an architecture, like a fantasy architecture like this, it's actually really important to keep in mind too. And I'll show you what I mean. So if we're just looking at this photo, we can try and identify some really big iconic shapes within it that we can pull from, and that'll help us get a little bit less intimidated by kind of the complexity of it. So, I mean, this one's kind of an up angle, so I'm actually going to choose this one, which is the whole bit more of the whole building. So if we were to like kind of sketch over this shape, I think it would be kind of like this. And I could choose maybe to pick out some of these like stepped formations here. And that might be one way of like breaking down what the overall big shape of this is, kind of like that. But I think these pointy like spires here are so strong actually in this case that has to be within the big shape itself. So I guess there'd be like a box down here, generally speaking. Remember, we're trying to simplify this as much as possible. And then there's a lot of really, really pointy shapes. For simplicity's sake, I'm only going to add, let's do like a couple on each side. Then there's, I think, another box here. And then actually this part here is kind of like a triangle shape. So if we're really to simplify this way, 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 way down, that's kind of one way to interpret the big shape of this. But then there's actually medium shapes within that. So if we like kind of zoom in, we can see this, you know, in the big shape, I kind of drew this whole section as a box, but within that, there's like these inner boxes. So there's like one, maybe two, oops, maybe three. And I think probably this long, thin piece here counts as a medium shape. And then, you know, if I shrunk this down a bit, it's actually kind of looks like there's one on this side as well. So maybe some of those are the medium shapes that we could think about, where there's like these inner cubes and boxes, and then there's these really tall things. And remember, this is all within that larger shape. Just as a reminder, there'd be many, oops, you know, many of these within here. And then within even those medium shapes, there's actually these really, really small details, which we're also going to try and simplify for our own design sense. And that's kind of like these triangles here. I guess there's this window shape is pretty important to this. And then there's actually, it looks like there's two pillars on either side of here. So I'm going to draw that pillar here. And just because to drive this point home, I mean, there's actually even smaller little like sections there. So I'm going to segment that off. So let's say those are some of the medium shapes. It's kind of like this inner archway within, well, it's within these medium shapes, and then those are within these big shapes. Okay. And we could kind of apply the same thinking of breaking down big, medium, and small to every single one of these reference photos. I mean, real quick, here, this one probably has, if you were to view this from a front view, it probably would be like a bit stepped like that with a really strong turret here, this tower. I'm just kind of like trying to figure out what that would look like from the front view roughly, but let's just say that's kind of the big shape. And then within that, there's actually this really tall kind of with a point on top, I think is kind of important to it, but basically it's these tall shapes here. There's one, maybe a couple more of those would be like the medium shapes. And then some of these small shapes are pretty different, where, I mean, there's a lot we could kind of look at, but you see this like clover shape. It's like 4 round half circles. And then, I mean, kind of this like Gothic rounded, almost like buttons or bubbles here kind of are like pretty iconic. And actually these gargoyles sticking out are kind of part of that to me, right? So maybe those are some of the small shapes. So we've got, let's make this a little bit bigger just so we can see it. So we've got that clover shape, then some of those like Gothic, like baubles almost, little details. Okay, so big shape, there's medium shapes within that, and then even within those, there's kind of these really, really small details that we can incorporate on that. Okay, so that line of thinking is, I mean, I know it's super simple and broken down here, but if we actually use that same process for some of the micro aspects, it's going to make a lot more sense on how do we actually start mixing these things. So super quick, let's just pick this example. I think I was saying before, one thing that stood out to me was the colors, but also like this grouping of shapes is kind of unique. So there's like a larger grouping. This is a very, very, very sloppy sketch of it, but it's a larger grouping, and then there's a whole bunch of really small shapes that are almost very similar to that larger shape, actually, kind of grouped within here. So I guess that would be the large shape. These would be kind of the medium shapes. And then if you actually zoom way in, I guess the small shapes in this case, like what makes this stand out in terms of detail, I guess it's the curve of these petals here could be considered a small shape. But then also there's just kind of interesting, if you zoom way in, this is probably getting pixelated, but there's these really interesting, almost like veins here. So if I were to just pick one of those vein patterns, it's kind of like, what is this still drawing? Sorry, I think I'm on the wrong layer. kind of like this line here, and then this double, almost arrowhead shape on the outside. See that? I'd consider that a small shape of within there. So let's make that a little bit bigger. So we've got this big shape with these small circular shapes, and then, or sorry, those are the mediums, and then this is the small within there. So now that we kind of know how to break down those shapes, let's do one more. I mean, this thing, there are actually some big shapes. I mean, let's ignore the eye thing because that's like a bit too gimmicky, but I think the bigger shapes here would be these vertical, almost like bark segments, right? There's like one here, there's one generally here, and then there's one generally here. But then within that, there's these medium textural bark segments, and they actually are really interesting because they flow together. So, and I think that's part of what makes it interesting from a texture perspective. So even though like these verticals are very somewhat, I mean, they're organic to an extent, but they're generally speaking, they're pretty vertical. These actually flow kind of following this pattern. So all of these medium shapes here are generally following the same path. So they kind of move together. Okay, so I would consider that the medium shapes of this segment here. And then let's just try to see if we can pick out the smallest shapes if we zoom way in as well, because that's one more thing that we could pull from. I think it is this like layered ridges that's real small in there, especially from this like side view, but that's really cool kind of layered feel. And it is very textural because it's so small, and you kind of feel it here as well. Just very, it is just like almost like the texture of it if you zoom way out, but it's still an interesting little detail that we could pull from. Okay, so what we need to do is kind of decide which one of these micro images we're going to mix with which macro and actually start sketching. So let's give that a shot. All right, before we continue, I want to make one last point about playing with big, medium, and small shapes. And I know this is going to seem super basic. It probably looks basic right now. It's just some primitive shapes up here, different sizes that we're going to try playing around with. But honestly, the basics are super important. Like this, just like taking a breath and really trying to examine how we can arrange shapes, even simple shapes, to make interesting designs. I think it's going to be the most important part of the next process. So if we just take 1 second and really try and examine how we can do it, it's going to save us so much time and headache later. So let's talk about it. So in this first group, I have a large simple shape, a large medium triangle, a small square, some variations below. And let's just try something. Let's just try moving them around and overlapping them for a second and see if we can get an interesting abstract arrangement. And then we'll also talk about what makes them interesting and what makes them not interesting. I mean, there's a few things we can talk about. I think if I balance, the main thing is that of contrast, right? If we balance this large circle with a really small, let's even get rid of this triangle for a second. If we balance a large circle with a really small cube, all of a sudden we get a contrast that's kind of somewhat interesting to look at. And it's relative. It's not that interesting to look at, but it's more interesting than if I had a similarly shaped cube next to it and it wasn't even overlapping. They're just next to each other. All of us now we have just two medium shapes and there's no contrast or focal point or area to look at. But if I shrink this way down, put it here, all of a sudden we have a focal point. We have a huge area of negative space that doesn't fight with the focal point. And in fact, it even leads you to the focal point kind of through these outer curves, okay? And now if we introduce even more complexity like this medium triangle, here's where it gets really interesting. This is all relative. I know this is super simple, but I really actually have to think about where to place this. And I know how basic this must seem, but let's think about this for a second. If I put it here, it's kind of interesting how this medium triangle points to the focal point. I think I like that, but it might be it's like too obvious, I think, the way it points to that. So let's try some other areas. I think if I put it right here, all of a sudden we've broken up this circle in a bad way, because this half of the circle is now too similar a size to this half of the circle. So if we put it a little bit more, let's try something like that. That's kind of interesting. This is very abstract and esoteric. I mean, there are rules to this, I think, in terms of the big and medium and small, like negative spaces, but there's also just a very much, an aspect of personal taste and feel to this. I kind of like it out here just because it does keep that big area of negative space, and then this is like a secondary thing to look at. So let's just keep that for a second. Okay, let's try something else with different shapes. Maybe this overlaps here. Maybe this overlaps a bit more on the top. And I can scale this if I want to. I could make it a rectangle maybe. See, now what we have going is we've added a focal point to the triangle with this circle. It's a small area of detail. And this simple edge leads you to this area of detail. And this edge is more simple than these other edges because I've broken those up with some complexity of this box. So now we have the longest area of simplicity of this triangle leading you to an area of focus, of detail. Okay, that's going to be really important. And then secondarily, we've split up this, is that a word, secondarily? We've split up this triangle into a small piece here. That's this space. And then a large piece here where this rectangle is. And now it's a large contrasting with a small. Okay. We could continue to mess around with this forever. We could add some more triangles, see what happens there. Maybe a small triangle overlapping here. Maybe really small triangles pointing or arrayed around this thing could be cool. I mean, I don't know. Do you guys like abstract art? I do. It's fun. It's not always my thing, but when it is, like when I see an abstract piece that I like, I notice that usually what drew me to it is exactly this. It's an arrangement of shapes that give me a big, medium, and small areas of detail. And then there's also, contrast of shapes with, circles, triangles, and cubes. And it's often it does follow a very specific formula for me that I like, and that's everything that we've described. So it is abstract, but it still follows some sort of interesting pattern that I think it is what makes a lot of art beautiful, like an arrangement of shapes to a lot of people. Obviously, this is going to be slightly different for everybody. So now I have I've enhanced this area of focus by adding this little triangle here and some other interesting arrangement of shapes around it. I think we have a secondary read kind of over here with these really small shapes contrasting with this really large shape. And then I guess this would sort of be the third read. So we're going to try and get like a 1, 2, 3 read for some of these, which I think is kind of usually a good way to go about it. Let's try one more with like a different size. Let's try a really large cube. And then our small and medium shapes, let's make them even smaller so they contrast even more actually in this case. Let's just try something. Oops. Let me just select this. Let's make that even smaller. And then this even smaller. There's a world in which this centered could be cool. If you're going to go with a design or a composition that is very, very centered, I think you have to kind of own it. That seems to be the general rule. So like if this triangle and circle were not in the very center, it would look a little bit off. So if they were like here, I think that generally would just make people feel like, to me, literally just looking at this area here, it makes me feel uncomfortable because it's just off center. Versus if it's over here, well, that's fine because it's a focal point in a corner. Okay. But if it's just off center, it doesn't look as good to me. So if you are going to go centered, you can go very, very centered and make everything really, really feel that way. And I think when you look at concept art and paintings that are very centered, you start to feel this where if they are gonna trend that way, then they're gonna really, really own it and really feel very, very centered. We could make like a whole other interesting arrangement that really leads you to the center. And we could try all kinds of things. I mean, there could be a second read that is less centered after the first read. So right now we have the center, which is clearly the most interesting part. Let's make a medium shape over here. And all of a sudden, this is kind of like a secondary read, second area to look at. And it's important that I made this a medium shape because we already have this small area and this large area. So now this medium shape kind of enhances that, now we have a large, a medium, and a small. And keep in mind the way that we're overlapping everything, because this is going to come up in the next section when we do line drawing. Because I intentionally didn't add fill to this, which you totally could do, you know what I mean by fill? If we literally add like a fill to this, you could do this too. Oh, whoops, I lost it. You could do this too and still get, some lines, some fill. There's many very cool designs that play with this. And you could also think about like if it were a paint stroke, like this would be a fill, right? And there's lots you could do with that. I could clip that to here, and now we have some other interesting abstract designs. But yeah, so the way that I didn't add fill at first is intentional because when we start overlapping our line drawings, we're going to get something like this, where like this is a large shape, even though it's broken up by this overlapping medium shape. But I still feel this as a large shape and this is a medium shape. Does that make sense? Even though they're overlapping, because they're line drawings. Okay. So keep that in mind. We're going to use all these principles. I'm just trying to think of as anything else we can do with this. I don't know. Give it a shot if you want. You don't have to, but just I think these principles are really going to help us. Okay, so let's actually get started with some sketching and see how it goes. I've just kind of pulled some of my favorite reference, or I kind of took another look at the macro and micro examples that I had and just ended up pulling these. I think it might be too many influences. Like I was saying, it's probably best to pare down, but I don't know. We'll try and focus on one or two of these, and maybe the other ones will just be there in case we get stuck. And then if we get really stuck, we can always just go back to those options and pull some others. But yeah, so let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually start thinking about some of the smaller shapes and then build outward. Some people like to start with like a larger silhouette and that kind of thing, and that might make sense in certain cases. But first, I just want to establish a little bit of like a visual language, and then use that kind of as like Lego building blocks to build out the rest of the architecture. All right, so I've sped up the video here and I'm recording over it a little bit later. I find that tutorials made this way just, I don't know, they seem to help me better. I'm able to get kind of more information and kind of looking back, there's certain things that after the fact, I think I might be able to warn you about or tell you about rather than just me figuring it out live and you know, doing it that way. So yeah, so the first thing I've done here is I started out with a small shape of the window there, and then I'm trying right now to just combine it with the small flower shape. And I had to stretch the flower shape a little bit to kind of overlap it and make them kind of overlap in the way that I liked and feel like they match together. But ultimately, I think I kind of made them overlap there. And right now, I'm building outwards. So I'm going from small to large. So I have that small initial shape with the bell shape or the flower shape, and I'm just fitting it into some kind of a box proportion based off of the reference castle there. And you can see me scrolling up there and checking the archways once in a while. I'm trying to just get a feel for the spacing of the archways there, and I'm just trying to match that somewhat with my own flower shapes archways. And then I have a problem right now, and you can see me highlighting that with this red, which is that distance of that box there felt too similar to the other proportion of area there. So just by shortening that top part, all of a sudden we have two edges that are um, kind of better contrast against each other, a small box versus a large box. So now I'm just trying to get something going with these little turrets. I'm kind of matching the reference there pretty closely. All I'm doing is just, again, using the design language of this flower shape or the bell shape. In my mind, those are very similar. This particular flower kind of looks like a bell. And just overlapping it with areas that kind of make sense for it to go with in the turret shape. So yeah, right now I'm thinking about like a little bit of in addition to the inner design there, thinking there might be some kind of filigree that sort of um, adds to the silhouette of that little top turret shape. And you can see I was looking at those little gothic um, bubbles again, and I'm thinking maybe those could be the little flower shapes once again. I don't think I end up actually using that too much later because I kind of go further from the Gothic design language in the end. But for now, it was helpful just to get me started with something useful. So I'm adding in that little window shape there and trying to think how I can make it more like more in the design language of the flower. So right now it's just adding a little bit of filigree. That's that golden thing. I'm kind of thinking that would be an extra metallic piece that would fit onto an inset window, right? So there'd be like two different sections. So right now you can see I'm trying to show that there needs to be a big, medium, and small spacing of these windows. So I originally had it two halfway down the middle. All right, so I'm adding on these turrets to the middle section there, and I'm still matching the reference really, pretty darn closely, just kind of building outwards. I will eventually stray from this quite a bit, but for now, I think using these proportions straight from the reference photo helped a lot just to get me started. And I did use these as building blocks, like we talked about with like Lego pieces. And then later I changed the proportions of everything. Okay, so now it's time for me to start thinking a little bit more big picture. And you can see I'm sketching in that red over the wide view of Mont Saint Michel to try and get an understanding of what that would look like. So it occurred to me that I might need like a base piece down at the bottom here to kind of offset the main structure that it might sit on. Architecturally, it just feels right that it would sit on some kind of a base. So that's what I'm sketching down there at the bottom. And now I'm running into a big issue, which is there's way too many box shapes, and it doesn't feel like it's working with the flowing flower language. So I'm trying my best right now to break up those initial rectangles that we sketched in there. And you could see there I'm adding additional curving shapes everywhere I can, basically. But most importantly, I think it was those two edges and that middle box there that changed things up a bit, just so it didn't feel like the main shape of the structure was a box. It was more of a flowing shape. And you can see on the side there, I'm sketching constantly just to illustrate that these proportions need to be big, medium, and small on all edges, right? So, if you look at it from the side view, we don't want to see a halfway point that's too even. If you look at it from the front view, it's the same thing. You just want to see a big, medium, and small distances, and it's really important to kind of think about that in 3D space as if you were seeing it from all views, because we are eventually going to make this in 3D, and it kind of will help the overall design if we think about that ahead of time. Okay, so now I'm just trying to add on this tower up here. Originally, I'm just trying to match that tower from the reference there just to get an understanding of the proportions. And then I'll go in and try to use the flowing shape language of these flowers to break up those rectangular kind of boxy shapes again. There you can see I'm showing those are two similar, those two shapes. So I made one smaller, and now it's offset by the main larger shape from the flower. So I'm thinking about that golden kind of metallic filigree again, and this will come up over and over as I go because um, I think in the end it did help the design to think about this metallic. It's not really filigree; it's more like a piping that sort of flows around the architecture, and it does help to break up kind of um, the shapes that I felt boxed in by from the reference. So yeah, just these yellow accents really helped me to kind of, especially sketching in a different color, it kind of like made me think about it in a different way, and sort of opened up, things that I might not have tried before. So this middle area of the tower, it felt a little bit too busy, and I ended up erasing some of that central area just to simplify it. And we can add in more details later, but right now having it simple in the middle there, it helps make that feel like the important area that you look at because it's an area of rest for the eye. Okay. So yeah, just like we talked about, you want to offset areas of rest by areas of high detail, and that's exactly what I'm messing around with right now. Just trying to overlap and get some happy accidents where we get that nice area of rest offset by an area of detail. So you can see that initial tower shape wasn't quite complex enough, and I ended up just adding on some larger areas of the same exact design language. I'm just reusing that same flower shape over and over and over again. But I'll stretch it, I'll squash it, I'll erase parts of it, and just by using that initial building block, it really helps to keep the design language of this thing, uh, you know, the same throughout. So I'm just going to try and duplicate this tower that we were somewhat happy with in a couple of different areas. Um, I think ultimately the shape language of that little tower top piece was a little bit more successful. So we're going to try to use that moving forward. And I think it ultimately, it matched the flower shape a little bit closer. So now it's time to kind of zoom out a bit more. I think we have enough pieces, small little pieces there to use in kind of thinking a little bit differently about, take another pass at the bigger structure. So I'm looking at that leaf shape there actually, and I'm thinking maybe from a side view that could actually be similar to the roof of this building, or a smaller roof part of this building. Um, and I'm going to add those little half circles under there, just so that I'm thinking that could be like a little balcony that people could stand in eventually. And I'm making those little arrows there because I'm thinking maybe this whole building could be skewed to the right a little bit, and that would make it, help with the feeling that it was so boxy before when we were matching the reference. And then I'll go ahead and grab the tower that we already created, and I'm just trying to integrate that roof part a bit more. Maybe this inspired by little leaf shapes again there could help with the integration, or maybe there's like almost like root structures that kind of curl around the tower and integrate it better. You can see me trying different places there with the tower, just sort of moving it around and seeing what feels right. And I'm even thinking like the inner design of the tower could be integrated into that leaf shape there at the top. So yeah, I'm kind of like trying a totally different tack with this section. And I'm thinking that, I'm making that arrow there because that I want that leaf pathway to point your eye to the focal point, which would be the tower. So I will go ahead and steal that kind of architectural base there at the bottom from the other sketch, but I will just try and change the edges a little bit just so that they're not so rectangular, and add in another one of those pointy, they're sort of like the leaf shape or more like the petal shape as well. So right now I'm just going to move. By the way, this is a helpful kind of Photoshop organizational thing, but I'm just grabbing a bunch of different pieces of this sketch at once by holding Control and clicking and dragging, and it's making a box, and it's grabbing a bunch of layers at once. So now I was trying a little bit of a value breakup there, and I think it's kind of time to think about that kind of a thing. Generally speaking, you want there to be a nice 1, 2, 3 value read in these kinds of designs. And we could have started that way with that little light highlight and the whole silhouette method first. But now that I'm a little bit happier with this overall shape, I just kind of ready to block it in there. Once we had all the smaller pieces in place. So I did go ahead and steal those 3 archways, those flower-shaped archways from the other sketch. I think that was a little bit closer to the reference as well. And I think those repeating archways are important to bring this kind of crazy organic shape a little bit back to the real world reference. Because that's kind of one of the main things that I see when I look back at the reference are those archways, and I want it to match. So I'm showing the rule of thirds right now in that reference. And I don't know if you're familiar with the rule of thirds, but basically if you break up a picture into 3 boxes vertically and horizontally, it's very common with compositions, but also with designs like this that you want to it helps you think about splitting it up into 2/3 of the design are the large part, and then 1/3 is the smaller part. And that's kind of what was showing you there, where the leaf shape at the top, that's kind of the roof of the structure, is just the 1/3, and the rest of it is feeling like the 2/3. And I'm happy with that kind of breakup, because this easily could have been another situation where it was halfway up, and then the roof started, and that would have felt a little bit less interesting and dynamic. So I added a nice dark black under that balcony as well, just to kind of hint at a shadow. So right now I'm just looking at that bark picture again, and I'm kind of thinking now would be a good time to sort of integrate those smaller flowing shapes into the roof there. And since that leaf shape was already kind of organic feeling, it felt like the right place to introduce some more of this really organic kind of bark structure. So I'm painting it in this, light blue, just to, visually see it, stand out a little bit differently. And it felt like the right time to introduce a very small shape to this, just because I was starting to feel happier with the big, medium, and small breakup of the rest of it. But I think it was good that we waited, until now to start thinking about these really, really small details. Because if we had started too small, it might have hurt. It might have kept us from building outward fast enough. And lastly here, I'm thinking that blue material could actually be the same roof material as in these other areas, like here in the tower, and then also in that leaf shape. All right, so I'm actually coming back to this a little while later. And one thing I'd like to try still is incorporating a few more of these pointy leaf shapes. I think we sort of transitioned from these like flowery bell shapes to sort of these intermedium intermediate medium size shapes. But when we got into the overall silhouette, we kind of went with these large leaf shapes as a repeating element. So I'm curious if we can push that a little bit more in the silhouette. Maybe this point here could be more emphasized if we sort of bring this side back in a little bit. But still definitely want to keep the asymmetry here. So I'm going to try something like that. Let's get rid of this silhouette line for a second. So just to show you what I'm thinking, I'm going to group this up and cut out everything here. So now this long curve is going to lead you to this point on one side that's balanced by the focal point on the other side. Feels a bit more balanced. I wonder if this line could even be more emphasized. Right now it's kind of halfway, like this curve ends halfway along this shape. So it kind of either needs to go a little bit less in, like that, or a little bit more in. I think a little bit more in just to make it really strong. So let's delete all this. And I know we're losing some of those arch details, but that's okay. We'll find a way to incorporate that back in at some point. Okay, so I'm happy with that. Now this pointy leaf shape, it sort of is balanced better on this side now by this pointy leaf shape. And we've definitely got a large and a small, which are contrasting nicely. I am missing those archway shapes though, and we did just lose them completely. I wonder, let's duplicate that. I wonder if we could try those down here actually as like really small little archways. Let's just try a couple things here. I mean, even just like a repeated element down there could be cool. One thing I think on this bottom cap is a good opportunity to add a more interesting decorative element as well. And then I was kind of thinking one area we could really use it, or one image we haven't used is this one. So let's just draw that pattern for a second. So it's kind of complex. Let's see, it's it's like an eye shape. And you'll notice, by the way, I don't think I've talked about this yet, but one thing I'm doing when I'm drawing is hitting Control Z every time I'm not happy with a shape. And I think that's kind of a really important aspect of digital drawing, actually. And that's because when you're drawing traditionally, it's so much easier to get a nice, clean shape. And then when you're drawing digitally, it's actually much more difficult, especially if you're using a tablet and not a Cintiq, which I am using. So one way to get around that is to draw quickly. So you get more dynamic, more, what's the word? Stronger shapes. And then another trick is to hit Control Z if the shape isn't perfect. So I think that's sort of underutilized a lot in digital drawing. So keep that in mind. So let's see it. We'll do it that double shape there. I'm not going to match the pattern exactly up here, but I just want to kind of be inspired by it a little bit. It's like a double, just because we have it and I like it. And I think it goes well with the flowy language that we have established. So, oops. Let's duplicate that, put it upside down. Maybe even if they overlap a little bit. I think that's too much. Let's try that. And then they kind of connect to each other there. Just doing this off to the side for now. Something like that I think is kind of cool. So that's the pattern. And I kind of want to try that as a small shape down here. Could go with these half circle eye shapes that we've already established. It also kind of looks like another leaf shape. So that goes well with the current line of thinking as well. Let's shrink it down even more. It needs to be a very small little element down here. Might duplicate it a few times just so the lines feel a little thicker. Merge that. Yeah, I think that's well. Actually, in this section down here, we need to think about which decorative element is the big and which decorative element is the small. And I think this can just be a really thin, small lining up here. Just gotta place it. Yeah, something like that. Okay, let's think about this silhouette one more time. Just want to get it perfect. I think this is too symmetrical. So if we angle it a little bit more, bring back that mask, it's feeling a little bit more dynamic. I wonder if there could be another line here. There we go. I think that's kind of cool. Sometimes I just hit R and rotate the canvas upside down just to kind of look at it from a different point of view. I mean, the other way to do that, of course, is the classic flip it horizontally. Take a look at that. Okay, I like those shapes. All right, and it's time for the final kind of segment and stage of the sketching process. And I've actually just taken the sketch that I liked the most, or the development that I liked the most. I put it on a totally new canvas, and I'm just gonna cut out pieces that I think were the coolest and the most successful, and really just use them over and over again to really drive home the shape language. So it's kind of like I've like designed the Lego pieces that I want, and now I'm finally ready to build with them. And I kind of like did this already in the previous section, but now it's like another pass, another kit bashing pass. And this kind of process, I've done this for a little while now, and for it works more with really pushed kind of high fantasy, sci-fi designs, right? Because you're going to get some more abstract stuff this way. But you'd be surprised, using the same shape language over and over again comes up a lot in a lot of different types of design. Even if eventually you could use this method to get something somewhat abstract, and then draw over it to get to add in sort of functional industrial detail sometimes. So yeah, this kind of works, at least for me, in a lot of different methods. So you can see me just messing around right now. I'm merging things, I'm cutting things out, stretching things, um, and I ended up sort of mirroring and trying something more symmetrical. It's funny, this whole time I was trying to get something asymmetrical with that main pointy leaf shape, um, and I think it sort of worked as a singular element. But I actually liked how that asymmetrical piece, when it's sort of mirrored like that and into a symmetrical design, it sort of felt like a nice contrast where it's like a really asymmetrical piece mirrored to make something symmetrical. So that's kind of like my justification for doing that. But we'll see. Maybe later in the 3D stage, we'll once we model some of this and then put everything into Blender, maybe we'll try some segments of this and then bring it back to some asymmetrical design. I could see it working, and if this were like a whole city, some buildings would be symmetrical and some wouldn't. So not totally married to that yet, but we'll see. So I'm getting to that stage where things are overlapping so much now that it's getting hard to read and too busy. So you can see I'm actually lassoing and adding a white fill in there to that one piece. And that's just so that when I put it on top of other elements, it hides what's behind it. So it's starting, even though this is a flat orthographic front view, it's starting to feel like there's like elements that are layered in front of each other that hide what's behind them, and that's going to be really important as we move forward, just for readability. Right now, I'm thinking of adding these little points at the end here, and this is all about emphasizing what's already there, right? So we kind of hit that stage in the last segment where we decided to emphasize the point of that roof, and that helped a lot with the design. And I was thinking maybe some spikes here could further emphasize it, just drive that point home even more. But ultimately, it felt too dangerous with those spikes, I think. And it, pretty quickly as I was adding them, I started to decide that it didn't feel like, the beautiful palace energy that we were going for. Felt a little bit too warlike, so ended up deleting that. And so now I'm kind of happy with the general sense of things. So I'm adding this white fill to everything. It's a little bit of a tedious process actually, because you kind of have to like paint everything, paint in the silhouette back in once these line elements are there. But it's worth it because we can use that silhouette as a mask. See, now I'm trying different colors with it. I'm gonna, clip some more layers to it, and then it'll help us break up the value read into a nice 1, 2, 3 at the end. I ended up with green. It could have gone, with 100 different color designs, but I ended up with green just because it felt a little bit more. Um, it almost felt elvish, which is sort of, I think that was one of our keywords in the beginning, or something elf-like. In my mind's eye, I'm kind of picturing this in a setting where there's a lot of greenery and trees. So, anyways, for now, that's the sense we're going to go for. So I lightened the background just behind there. That's just for my own presentation sense. And I'm really starting to think about, the interior value reads here. So that yellow is going to be super important, that gold filigree or wireframe that we were talking about before, just as a final, well, I guess it's like it's a third value read, right? Because we have each color here has its own value, right? So the green's kind of our dark, the blue, I guess, was kind of our medium, and the yellow is kind of popping into the lightest value there. So that's going to be really important because, just like the big, medium, and small design sense that we kind of thought about throughout this whole process, the value reads need to also feel that way, where you've got a big segment of that green value, medium breakup of the blue roof values, and then just that tiny little final touch of the yellow or gold or whatever it ends up being will kind of be that final focal point and emphasis. So we're just trying to emphasize these flashy curves in here, using that filigree. And I'm not totally sure what material all this is going to be yet. We probably won't even think about materials um, until the blender phase, really. I mean, we'll keep the 3 value reads in mind, but these 3 materials could be anything, right? They could be stone, they could be metal. And I'm thinking that's kind of a last touch, just because that's the final details. So I'm adding in some spaceships there because I'm thinking maybe there could be some sci-fi element to this. And I mean, pretty much done. I'm just kind of darkening some things, adding in some final little people there for scale, which was kind of in the back of my mind the whole time. Probably should have added those in earlier. But yeah, just cleaning up a little bit. I'm not going to take this too far, and we'll jump into the 3D.